Allora do la parola adesso a Thomas Pogge per il suo speech. Thank you. Give the floor.
Good. I'm very happy to be here, and congratulations on your soccer win. I feel I am...
That's loaded, very loaded.
Sorry. I'm German, so...
Yes, exactly.
So I won't wish you good luck for the next time round. Okay, anyway. But I feel I'm among friends here because we are obviously all people who care about poverty, care about children. And in that regard, we are a very small minority in the developed countries. And what we need to do, I think, is act with intelligence to really make a difference. It's not just important to care, but it's important to act, and it's important to act intelligently. So to prepare for that, let me tell you a little bit about the situation that we are facing. We have about 7 billion people in the world, and very large numbers of these people suffer from poverty-related deprivations of one sort or another. You can see here the latest figures from various sources. People are chronically undernourished, lack access to essential medicines, safe drinking water, adequate shelter, electricity, adequate nutrition, illiteracy, and also 218 million children who do wage work outside their own households. So that's a very enormous amount of suffering that is still going on in this world, despite the fact that we have rising average incomes and, on the whole, a pretty well flourishing economy. At the very least, 1/3 of all human deaths are still due to poverty-related causes, about 18 million out of 57. And that's a very conservative calculation. How I calculated that is simply to add causes of death that are unknown among the rich countries. So you can see here, these are all causes that are almost exclusively in the poor countries. Poor people in poor countries die of the same things that we die from as well, and often they die much sooner than we do because of increased disease vectors and lower medical care. But I've not even counted any of those deaths to reach the 1/3 figure. If you put that in perspective, since the end of the Cold War, somewhere close to 400 million people died from poverty-related causes, greatly outnumbering all the deaths from government-sponsored violence during the entire 20th century, which was about 200 million in the entire century, including the gulags, the concentration camps, and so on. So it's a very large catastrophe, by no means just confined to the ongoing global economic crisis. Now, if you ask me why this is still happening, why is this still going on, the superficial answer is it has something to do with the way in which our income is distributed. So these are the figures about the income distribution in the world. What you see here is us. We are the top 5% of the world's population, and we have about 46.4% of global income. And these here are the next 20%. So now we have a full quarter of the human population, over 90% of global income. This is the second quarter. This is the third quarter. And now comes the eye test, the fourth quarter. A very tiny 0.78% of global income goes to the bottom quarter of the human population. Now, this is the same diagram again in a different form because I want to show you how that distribution has changed over the last so many years. So I can flip these two back and forth. And you can see that the only segment of the human population that has had a gain, a total gain of 3.5% of global household income, was the top 5%. The others lost to various degrees, and the ones who lost the most are the ones in the bottom quarter. Look at that little blue square on the left bottom. The bottom quarter went from 1.16% to 0.78%, and so they lost about 1/3 of their share of global household income. obviously far more than is made up by the fact that global average income has also risen during that period. Now here's the consequence of that. These are the figures about people who are chronically undernourished, and you can see that that figure has gone up. You already mentioned the increase in food prices. The number of people who are chronically undernourished has gone up, not just in the last few years, but it's gone up pretty steadily since 1996. I've put the 1996 number in red because that was the year of the World Food Summit in Rome. In that year, the governments promised that they would halve that number by 2015, so down to 388 million. As you can see, that number never went down at all. It went up since that time. The year 2015 reminds you of something, I take it. It is the year that the Millennium Development Goals always mention, and the Millennium Development Goals are diluted versions of that initial promise of Rome. So instead of aiming to halve the number of chronically undernourished people, the first Millennium Development Goal now aims to halve the proportion of the people in the developing countries who are chronically malnourished against the baseline of 1990. You already saw from the world income distribution that the poverty problem, large as it is in human terms, is actually quite small in economic terms. If the poor people in the world, the bottom half, instead of having just under 3% of global income, had somewhere around 5% of global household income, everybody's basic needs could be met. You can see here how large the gap is, depending on the World Bank poverty line. The World Bank works with a $1.25 poverty line that's in purchasing power parity, so they convert at using current prices as the baseline. But even if you take a much higher poverty line, $2.50 per person per day, even then the entire shortfall of all poor people living below that line is only about $500 billion. That sounds like a lot, but it's 2/3 of the military budget of just the United States alone. And it's about 1.4% of global household income. So shifting that from the top 5% to the bottom half would mean that instead of 46.4%, we would have 45%. It's not a big deal in economic terms. Now, why is that happening? Why is inequality increasing? Why is the top 5% gaining and why are the others losing? I think a very important component of the explanation is inequality spirals, which have been well studied by economists under the title of regulatory capture. Regulatory capture is simply the idea that those people who are much more advantaged, much richer, and better connected, better educated, more experienced, have an advantage in trying to shape the rules of the game in their own favor. As they do that, of course, the rules become more friendly to themselves. They gain further advantages, a larger share of the social product, and become even more able to shift the rules in their own favor. And so you get a spiral of increasing inequality where the rich change the rules, make the rules more favorable to themselves, and thereby become even richer relative to the rest of the population, and therefore more able to change the rules even further in their favor. Now, this kind of inequality spiral has come into its own with globalization. Globalization means many things. It means Facebook and Twitter and so on, but one very important component of it is the shifting upwards of the rules under which our day-to-day interactions take place. More and more of the most influential, most important rules governing our world are rules now at the supranational level. They're no longer fixed by national parliaments and national governments, but they're fixed in international negotiations at the G20 level, the EU level, the WTO level, what have you. And with regard to that supranational rulemaking, the inequality spiral kicks in with a vengeance. It is particularly powerful there. So if you have a few $1 million to invest and you want to lobby, don't bother with the Italian government. spent the money lobbying maybe the Italian government, but lobbying its international negotiating stance rather than national rules of the game. International rules of the game provide the largest returns for lobbying money, and here in particular, the reasons for why that is so lucrative is first that there's no democratic counterweight at the supranational level. There's no voting taking place that could constrain the influence that rich parties can exercise. There's very little transparency even ex post, unlike in national parliaments. And finally, moral restraints that would normally act on legislation can be dismissed here by reference to there being other powers with different values that cannot be relied upon to restrain themselves. It used to be the Soviet Union, but now it's predominantly China that gets mentioned. So the most cost-effective lobbying is really lobbying that focuses on supranational rules while also trying to shift governance upward from the national to the supranational level. It's done by the very wealthiest banks, corporations, industry associations, and it happens through influencing government officials, in particular in the United States. We have an election year now, and you can see how politics works in the US in pure form. It's really a system that is better described by $1, one vote than by one person, one vote. Now, here's an example of how that system has worked in one particular case with regard to the rules that govern the development and distribution of medicines. What we now have, following the TRIPS agreement, which was part of the creation of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in the mid-1990s, is a system in which we have a one-size-fits-all patent regime that grants innovators 20-year product patents on any new medicine, not just in some countries, but basically across the entire WTO. That contrasts with process patents, as they were common in many of the developing countries before. For example, in India, the most important country in this context, where we had process patents that could easily be circumvented by clever generic companies who would find different ways of making the same medicine and then sell it cheaply to Indian consumers and consumers across the developing world. Now that's the status quo, and let's compare that with three plausible principles that you might want to impose on any reasonable patent regime or any reasonable regime for providing medicines to people. Ideally, given how cheap medicines are to produce, they just are very small and need relatively cheap chemicals as ingredients. Ideally, we should have a scheme that makes medicines, at least important medicines, available to all people all over the world, regardless of their income and regardless of their country. Ideally, we should invest our research and development dollars in those projects that promise the largest returns in terms of human health. And ideally, we should make the entire system cost-effective so that any money that we spend on medicine is plowed right back either into research and development or into the manufacture of medicines. Now, the present regime as we have it fails pretty sharply in all these three domains. But the important thing is to see, can we actually do better? Is there an alternative to the existing regime? And I want to show you here how one could design a system that would actually be much more protective of the interests of poor people. We call it the Health Impact Fund regime, which is offered as a complement to the TRIPS regime, where innovators could voluntarily register their important medicines for participation in 10 consecutive years of annual reward pools, each of which would be divided among registered products in proportion to their health impact. So if you have a product that you register with the Health Impact Fund, and your product in a given year accounts for 8% of the health impact of all the registered products, you would get 8% of the reward pool in that year. So that is how the system would work. You would voluntarily choose at the point where your drug comes to the market whether to register or not, either availing yourself of your normal patent-protected markup powers or else getting the health impact rewards, which of course are tied to the condition that you have to give up that markup power. You can only have one of the two rewards. So you would have to sell the medicine if you register for rewards at the lowest feasible average cost of manufacture and distribution, as determined, for example, by a tender system where manufacturers could bid for the contract of producing the medicine. Now, the Health Impact Fund would achieve not only improvements in access, in innovation, and overcoming last mile problems, it would also be extremely cost effective by avoiding the cost of patenting in many jurisdictions, avoiding costly litigation, marketing, where often companies are competing, wasting a lot of money marketing competing products, counterfeiting, gaming, lobbying, and also very large deadweight losses. That is where the $850 billion that we are now spending on medicines largely goes these days. The Health Impact Fund, of course, avoids high prices. All medicines would be available from day one at the cost of production. It would end the neglect of the diseases of poverty by focusing innovative efforts on precisely those diseases where innovation can have the largest health gains. And it helps alleviate last mile problems in drug delivery by combining decent rewards with low prices, basically incentivizing innovators to try to overcome all those impediments that stand between them and effective health impact. So whatever needs to be done to make a medicine effective, to make it have as large a health impact as possible, is something that innovators would be incentivized to do. This was an example. It was just an example of how one would design institutions if one took all human beings equally seriously, if one paid equal attention to the flourishing and survival of all human beings on Earth. One wouldn't have a patent system where for the first 10, 15 years of a medicine only the rich can get access. One would use a system like that, where still, through public funding, the rich would pay for innovation, essentially, but poor people would get access more or less immediately. It's an example, and I could give you many other examples of how our rules, especially now at the supranational level, are designed with tender loving care for the most well-to-do citizens of the world, to the detriment often of the large majority. Now, in assessing this from a moral point of view, and I know you said that it's more than morality with Voltaire, but from a moral point of view, which we should start with, I think, we have to say that this system is a system that is deeply flawed. So look at what we are officially committed to. We are officially committed to human rights, and human rights include, already in the Universal Declaration, this one here. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of oneself and one's family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care. Now, the bottom half of the human population does not have secure access to these things. So for them, this human right is not or not yet fulfilled. And we can use that human right as a kind of minimal conception of justice and say what we should aspire to is to organize our world in terms of its rules and procedures in such a way that these basic human rights are fulfilled insofar as that's reasonably possible. And as I showed you at the beginning, the world is now certainly rich enough in aggregate to fulfill this human right quite easily across the world. We don't have to have the bottom half of the human population in severe poverty. So as a minimal condition of global justice, we can then assert that we should try to organize the rules and procedures, national and supranational, so that human rights are fulfilled insofar as that is reasonably possible. That too is already in the Universal Declaration, to which we committed ourselves over 60 years ago, where it says that everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. Now, there are two ways in which, in the face of this, we can try to meet the obligations that correspond to the human rights that are so far not fulfilled. One thing we should think about as affluent citizens of influential countries is how we can work via our governments to shape supranational institutional arrangements so that they are less harmful to the human rights of the world's poor. So this is where UNICEF comes in as one intergovernmental agency whose work can make a profound difference to children and, as you rightly said, thereby also to the whole future lives of these children and even the next generation. There are a lot of data now showing that children who grow up in poverty are far more likely to produce offspring that will again grow up in poverty. The other thing we can do as affluent citizens is to work together as individuals and small groups to protect the poor from the harms that these global rules are doing. Even if we can't achieve social changes, we can at least do things philanthropically to try to avoid some of the consequences of the existing system of rules. Thank you.